My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is what I built. Vance Robotics started in our garage when I was 15. My father, Richard, had the vision, I'll give him that. He could see a future where surgical robots would replace the shaky hands of tired surgeons. He could describe it at a dinner table and make everyone in the room lean forward in their chairs. But I built it. By the time I was 22, I had filed my first patent, a neural feedback loop that allowed robotic arms to self-correct in real time based on human tissue variation. Micro-adjustments, thousandths of a millimeter, happening faster than any surgeon could consciously react. My thesis advisor at MIT told me it was the most significant mechanical biological interface innovation she had seen in 30 years. My father told me to get back to the lab because we had a deadline. That was the thing about growing up in the Vance family. Praise was rationed. Affection was a transaction. You worked, and you worked hard, and if you were lucky, if you were very lucky, your father would nod once across the dinner table and say, quietly, "Not bad." I lived for that nod, more than I like to admit now. My brother Henry did not build things. Henry had a different talent. He could walk into a room and make every person in it feel like the most important person in the world. He was warm where I was clinical, charming where I was precise, magnetic where I was meticulous. And from the day he graduated with his business degree, our father positioned him as the future face of Vance Robotics, the voice, the handshake, the name that would appear on the stage at industry conferences. I told myself it didn't bother me. It bothered me. But I kept building. I kept filing. Over the next 7 years, I filed 23 patents under my own name, not the company's name, mine. That decision, the single most consequential decision of my professional life, came not from cunning or strategy, it came from a single piece of advice. During my second year at MIT, a professor pulled me aside after a seminar on intellectual property law. She placed a brief hand on my shoulder and said, "Maya, you are going to create things of enormous value. Always, always make sure those things belong to you." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I do now. The patents I held personally included the core algorithms that powered every fourth-generation surgical robot Vance Robotics manufactured. Without my licensing agreement, which I had renegotiated with the company's own legal team at age 26, with my name listed as licensor and the company as licensee, Vance Robotics could not legally manufacture or sell its most valuable product line, not a single unit. I didn't hide this from my parents. I told my father directly. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "That sounds like an accounting issue. Talk to Gerald." Gerald was our CFO. Gerald reviewed the agreement, confirmed it was legally airtight, and filed it in a cabinet. Nobody brought it up again. I thought we had an understanding. I was wrong about many things when it came to my family. But that particular mistake, that one I carried like a stone somewhere deep in my chest. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. My father's assistant rang when I was reviewing schematics for the next prototype iteration. Her voice was pleasant, professional. "Mr. Vance would like you in the boardroom at 2 o'clock. It's important." Important. In our family, everything was important. Tax filings were important. Birthday dinners were important. And apparently, so was selling everything I had ever built without telling me first. I drove to the office with the radio off. I did that sometimes when my mind was too loud. Took away all the noise so I could hear myself think underneath it. The October sky was that pale, still blue that looks peaceful but feels cold. And I remember noting that it matched my mood almost exactly. When I walked into the boardroom, I stopped in the doorway. It wasn't just my father and Henry at the conference table. There were 4 men in suits I didn't recognize, legal pads, leather portfolios, water glasses that hadn't been touched. And at the head of the table, Marcus Webb.
If you follow technology acquisitions, you know that name. Marcus Webb was the CEO of Omnis Systems, a conglomerate with interests in surgical AI, aerospace robotics, and autonomous systems. He had built 4 companies from the ground up and acquired 11 others. He was personally worth north of $12 billion. He collected companies the way some men collected watches, methodically, patiently, with an eye for what would become valuable before anyone else saw it. I felt my pulse tick up. My father rose when I entered. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal one he reserved for investor dinners and groundbreaking ceremonies. My mother, Diane, was to his left, her hands folded on the table, her expression arranged into something I could only describe as composed. Henry sat across from her, and he had the look on his face I had spent 30 years learning to dread. The particular arrangement of features that meant he already knew something I didn't. "Sit down, Maya." My father gestured to an open chair, not at the conference table, near the wall, a chair that had been placed at a slight remove from the main arrangement, as if I were there to observe rather than participate. I sat. "We have some news." My father cleared his throat. He had the posture of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and was bracing himself for the actual delivery. "We have reached an agreement with Omnis Systems for the full acquisition of Vance Robotics." The room was very quiet. "Full acquisition?" I repeated. $80 billion, Henry said, and I could hear the excitement bleeding through the cadence he was working to control. "It's the largest acquisition in surgical robotics history." I looked at my father, then at my mother, then at Marcus Webb, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Not triumph, not discomfort, something more deliberate than either. The careful attention of a man who understood that what he was witnessing mattered. "When was this decided?" My voice was steady. I was quietly proud of that. "Negotiations began 18 months ago," my father said. "We kept it quiet for legal reasons." 18 months. 18 months I had spent driving to that building every single day, designing, filing, presenting data in review meetings that were, apparently, cover for something else entirely. 18 months of being in that building, while my parents sat in this room and negotiated to sell everything I had built. "And the patents?" I asked. My father's jaw tightened. "The company has always licensed those patents internally. Legal confirmed that I am the licensor, that I am a private individual, that Vance Robotics pays me personally for the right to manufacture using those algorithms." My mother uncrossed and recrossed her hands on the table. "Maya, let's not do this here." "I'm not doing anything, Mom. I'm asking a question." "So you sold the company without my patents?" My mother looked at me steadily, and then she said, with the measured certainty of a woman who had consulted attorneys and arrived at this room feeling protected, "We sold our business." She said it with a smile, a small, composed, entirely self-assured smile. And that smile is what finally cracked the steadiness I had been holding since I walked through that door. I looked at my mother for a long time, long enough that the room grew uncomfortable, long enough that one of the men in suits shifted in his chair, long enough that even Henry's certainty seemed to flicker for just a moment behind his eyes. Then I turned to Marcus Webb. He had not said a word since I sat down. He had watched the exchange between my family and me with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was witnessing mattered. Late 50s, silver-haired, with the particular stillness that comes not from comfort but from discipline.
from decades of making decisions that cost or created enormous amounts of money. "Mr. Webb," I said, keeping my voice even, "are you aware that the core patent portfolio underlying Vance Robotics' fourth-generation surgical platform is licensed, not owned, by this company?" My father's hand moved to the center of the table as if he might physically intercept my words. "Maya, are you?" I asked again, looking only at Webb. Marcus Webb glanced at my father, then at me. He opened his mouth, and then Henry stood up. Henry rarely stood in rooms. He preferred to project ease, hand in a pocket, shoulder against a doorframe. But he stood now, and his voice carried an edge I hadn't heard from him before, something between authority and urgency. "The acquisition was structured around the company's assets. Our legal team reviewed everything comprehensively. The internal licensing agreement is a formality. It does not materially affect the core valuation." A formality. "Henry, I have been paying myself a personal licensing fee since I was 26 years old. It is a registered legal instrument. It is not a formality." "That agreement can be contested on the grounds that—" "On what grounds?" I asked. Henry's mouth closed. A beat of silence that felt very long. My father stepped in. His voice had dropped into the register I had known since childhood. Low, controlled, the tone he used when he wanted to signal that something was being decided and the time for discussion was over. "The deal is done, Maya. Signatures are in process. What we brought you here to tell you today is that the terms of the acquisition restructure leadership under Omnis Systems. Henry will serve as president of the new surgical robotics division." He took a breath. "And we are asking you to step back from your operational role." I waited. "We're handing all $80 billion to Henry," he said. "And as a condition of the new structure, now leave. You're exiled." The word landed in the room the way heavy things land, not loudly, but with complete finality. Not transitioning, not restructuring, not any of the careful, cushioned language that legal teams construct to make cruelty sound like logistics. My father had used that word because he wanted me to understand the full weight of what he was doing, and I did. I gazed at them in shock, my father with his hands on the back of his chair, my mother whose smile had faded into something more uncertain, Henry, whose eyes had moved to the window as if the October sky had suddenly become very interesting. And then, quietly, without hurry, with the particular quality of someone who has been waiting for precisely this moment, Marcus Webb stood up. The room shifted when he rose. It is difficult to describe the quality of attention Marcus Webb commanded when he chose to use it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply rose from his chair, adjusted the cuff of his jacket once, and regarded my father with an expression that was not unkind, but was entirely unmistakable. "Actually," he said. Just that, one word, and the oxygen in the room seemed to rearrange itself around it. My father frowned. "Marcus?" "Richard." Webb's voice was quiet, but had the quality of a closed door. "I need to speak." He turned to face the center of the table, not toward my father, not toward Henry, toward me. "Miss Vance," he said, "I owe you a direct conversation that should have happened before today, and I apologize for that." I said nothing. I was watching him the way I watched new data, without rushing to a conclusion. My team became aware of the personal patent licensing structure approximately 4 months into our negotiations with your father. He said it, plainly, without accusation or theater. Our intellectual property attorneys reviewed the registration records, the licensing agreements, the payment history going back 7 years. The patents underlying the fourth-generation surgical platform are yours, personally. They are not the company's to sell." Henry made a sound. My mother's hands came apart on the table. "What that means legally," Webb continued, "is that the acquisition of Vance Robotics, as currently structured, does not and cannot transfer those patents to Omnis Systems. It is not possible. Your father does not hold title to them." The silence that followed was extraordinary. I had imagined something like this moment in the abstract, the way you mentally rehearse scenarios you hope you will never actually need, but I hadn't anticipated how quiet it would be, how clean. My father's face had gone very still. The internal licensing agreement was always understood to be a licensing agreement, not an assignment. Vance Robotics licenses the use of those patents. It does not own them. He said it without impatience, the way someone states a measurement. I had 3 separate intellectual property law firms confirm this independently before I entered this building today. Henry turned from the window. "You knew?" There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, not quite disbelief, something closer to the feeling of realizing you have been standing on a surface that was never solid. "You knew," Webb said simply. "Then why?" Henry stopped. He was doing the arithmetic. I could see it in the set of his jaw. "Why proceed with the negotiation at all?" "Because I want to acquire Vance Robotics," he said, "and I knew that the only way to complete a legally sound acquisition, one that included full rights to the fourth-generation platform, was to ensure the actual owner of those patents was part of the transaction." He paused. "On her own terms." He looked at me. "I have been waiting," he said quietly, "for the right moment to speak with you directly." I thought about my professor at MIT, her hand brief and warm on my shoulder, her voice, "Always make sure those things belong to you." I thought about Gerald, filing the agreement in a cabinet without a second glance. I thought about my father's nod, the single nod across a dinner table I had restructured my early life around earning, and how I had mistaken it for security when it had never been more than momentary permission. And I thought about $80 billion. "Mr. Webb," I said, "I think we should have that conversation."
The next 3 hours were the most consequential of my professional life. I asked my father, my mother, and Henry to leave the boardroom. My father looked at me the way he had when I was a teenager who had stayed out past curfew, a mixture of anger and something that might, in another man, have been hurt. This was his company, his legacy, the building he'd spent 30 years constructing around a vision he'd had in a garage. But the building, as it turned out, had been built on a foundation he didn't own. He left. My mother followed without speaking. Henry paused at the door and turned back, and for the first time in our adult lives, I saw something in his face that wasn't confidence. I held his gaze, steadily, until he looked away. The door closed, and it was Marcus Webb, his team of 4 attorneys, and me. Webb's lead IP counsel, a precise, unhurried woman named Dr. Anita Ford, laid out the situation in 11 minutes. The existing acquisition agreement, she explained, was structured as a total asset transfer, without a separate patent assignment or expanded licensing agreement bearing my signature. The deal, as written, could not legally close. The $80 billion could not move. "What are you proposing?" I asked. Webb answered directly. "A negotiation between Omnis Systems and you, as the patent holder, for either a full IP buyout or for equity participation in the acquisition itself." He slid a folder across the table. "I'd like you to consider the second option seriously." I took a breath. "Walk me through it."
What followed was a negotiation I won't describe in full, partly because portions remain confidential, and partly because the precise figures matter far less than what they represented. What I will tell you is this. The final agreement gave me a direct equity stake in the Omnis Systems surgical robotics division, valued at close at just over $11 billion. My patents were assigned to a private holding entity I controlled, then licensed back to the new division under a structure that would generate royalties for the next 22 years. My role, should I choose to accept it, was Chief Technology Officer of the new division, reporting directly to Marcus Webb, not to Henry, not to anyone named Vance. The original $80 billion acquisition still moved forward. My parents received a significantly reduced sum for the non-patent business assets, the facilities, the equipment, the brand, the existing contracts, the manufacturing leases. Henry took his presidency. He got his title. He got his role. He just didn't get what he thought he was getting. I called my father that evening from the parking garage, sat in my car with the phone on the dashboard, engine running, windows fogging at the edges of the October cold. When he picked up, I didn't lead with anger. I didn't have room for it anymore. The day had required too many decisions, too much clarity. There was nothing left over for what I couldn't change. I said, "I want you to know that I didn't do this to hurt you." He was quiet. Then, soft, $11 billion, Maya. That's what it was worth, I said. You could have talked to me. At any point in the last 18 months, you could have called me into a room and had an honest conversation. I would have worked with you. I have always worked with you. I built those things, Dad. I built all of them. He said, finally, quietly, barely above a breath, I know. And then he said something I had spent my entire adult life waiting to hear, delivered not at a dinner table with a nod and 2 words, but over a phone speaker in a parking garage with the windows fogging and the cold coming through the vents. He said, I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to undo 30 years. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't the beginning of one. But it wasn't nothing either. And in the ledger of things I'd stopped expecting from my father, it landed somewhere I hadn't yet built a shelf for. I drove home with the radio off. But this time, it wasn't because my mind was too loud. It was because I wanted to hear myself, just myself, in the quiet. The sound of a woman who had spent her whole life building things that belonged to her, finally getting to keep them.